The siren started first, thin, metallic, and close. Red strobes washed over a mold-slick door as something thudded from the other side, slow and deliberate. A gloved hand scraped black biofilm. Wet threads curled and snapped. She leaned in, breath fogging inside her visor. "It's still alive," she whispered, not sure if she meant the mold or the room. Then a clink, steel under skin. 2 days earlier, her campus inbox pinged. An anonymous email with coordinates and one word in the subject line: BioShield. Minutes later, a shutdown notice hit the department. Her mentor called once. "If you find a seal, don't break it." She went anyway. It arrived in the wrong tray, mislabeled under a stack of routine environmental swabs from the condemned wing behind the biology building. She almost tossed it. Instead, she cracked the lid, and the petri dish exhaled a sour, phenolic breath. Overnight, the colony didn't creep, it surged. Black filaments vaulting across agar in glossy arcs like lacquer poured in slow motion. By morning, the incubator thermistor read several degrees warmer than set point. She checked the logs twice. Heat should have slowed it. It didn't. Under oblique light, pigments shifted with temperature, a bruised green sliding toward ink. When she probed the medium, her scalpel tip sparked, a faint metallic kiss that had no business inside a dish. For years, she'd watched grants fall through. Interesting, they wrote, but not strategic. She stopped counting. This sample felt different. It wasn't an opportunity. It was a door. Her mentor appeared in the threshold, sleeves rolled, voice low. Containment protocols, always. This pattern looks engineered. He didn't move closer. He just watched the sheen on the colony break and mend like oil. She swabbed a corner, sealed it, and took it to the micro CT. Fungal networks usually look like wild rivers. Branch, merge, branch again. This looked like scaffolding. Lattice-like filaments braided into trusses around microparticles that weren't dirt. The scan caught their geometry. Uniform, angular, manufactured. On the surface of one, a serial number was etched so small it blurred at the edge of resolution. "What nobody knew at the time," she muttered, then stopped. She didn't say it out loud. Instead, she pulled a second image and watched the colony's hyphae wrap the particles in precise spirals, as if instructed to anchor and occlude. Campus safety pinged her lab an hour later. Air sensors had flared on the floor. She signed the liability waiver with a hand that didn't shake until after the door closed. "You'll keep it here?" the officer asked, a question phrased like a warning. She nodded. Meanwhile, something else was happening in her inbox. The anonymous email thread had grown. No message body, only attachments. A floor map of the condemned annex. A faded photo of a recessed panel labeled Chamber K, and a clipped memo header: BioShield, containment by bio-occlusion. No letterhead, no signature. The metadata was scrubbed. She spent the afternoon running tests that shouldn't have belonged to a Friday. At 80 degrees Celsius, the colony curled, then unfurled, pigment concentration rising at the edges as if pooling a protective shell. UV exposure made it darken instead of blanch. She introduced a low dose of disinfectant. It didn't die. It redirected. Hyphae forming a ringed barrier around the microparticles like a moat. Get this. The thing didn't just survive stress. It used stress to reinforce structure. The thing about nature is that adaptation takes time. This had already learned. She tried to call her mentor back. The line rang. Then voicemail. She stared at the dish and made a decision she would later replay in every sleepless hour. Take a sterile scrape from the densest, darkest zone. When the scalpel slid under the biofilm, the blade snagged. Not on agar, on something harder. She eased pressure. The snag turned into the crisp, impossible clink of steel. A chill moved through her arms. She placed the fragment under the scope. Not steel plated over a microgrid, a mesh so fine it looked like silk. The hyphae had woven themselves through it and over it, locking it in place like rebar in concrete. It wasn't contamination. It was design. Her mentor's voice returned like an echo through time. This pattern looks engineered. She labeled the fragment, sealed it in a secondary tube, and pulled up the condemned wing's blueprint. The coordinates in her inbox lined up with the room no one used, the one with a door that never opened and a badge reader that still blinked green for no one. By evening, campus safety had filed a voluntary review. Facilities emailed a reminder. Do not enter condemned spaces. She read it twice, then packed a field kit, sterile scrapers, nitrile gloves, alcohol wipes, a disposable hood, a portable Geiger, out of habit more than fear. The waiver sat in her bag, still warm, with her signature. Before she left, she added one more test. She placed a small steel bead near the colony's edge, then drew a line of disinfectant between the bead and the growth. Hyphae paused, thickened, then bridged the gap in a slow, deliberate arc. The bridge hardened as it crossed the line, darkening to a near black glass. It didn't avoid the barrier. It sealed across it. If the sample was a message, the coordinates in her inbox were the map. She powered down the scope, set the incubator alarms, and locked the lab behind her. What nobody knew at the time was that the mold hadn't simply grown, it had been grown, trained to do one job: contain, occlude, guard. She stepped into the hallway, lights humming, night cleaning carts whispering past. The condemned wing waded across a courtyard of weeds and busted tile. She tightened the strap on her field kit and kept walking. This was the moment everything changed, though it wouldn't feel like change until she heard that sound again, the clink under living skin. The condemned wing didn't creak so much as settle, a concrete animal breathing through hairline cracks. Her badge shouldn't have worked on a lock that old, but when she tapped it, the reader blinked green like a reflex that survived after the brain quit. The door resisted, edges stuck with a black sheen. She pushed. The smell hit first, damp, phenolic, and sweet in a way that warned you back. Inside, the room was furred with black mold. Not the thin fuzz of neglect. Ropes, strands, braided thick and taut, draped from ceiling to floor like rigging on a ship. Under her headlamp, the surface gleamed, wet in places, matte in others. A landscape of scars where droplets had dried and set. The seal wasn't accidental. The hyphae had braided, thickened, and fused into a single living skin over something recessed in the wall. She stood still and listened. Rooms like this talk if you let them. There was a low, steady whisper, air moving somewhere it shouldn't. The portable Geiger clicked softly, lower than background in older buildings. Not nothing. Enough to make her keep the meter on. She snapped a sterile scraper into place, filmed the first cut on her phone without thinking, hands steady from years of sterile hood work. The blade slid beneath the biofilm. It lifted like rubber, elastic, stretching, then tearing with a wet sigh. Beneath, another layer, denser, almost glossy. She scraped again, deepening the trench, and there it was, the clink. Not a freckle of metal this time, a riveted edge. She widened the window. Letters appeared, stenciled in white under the slime, half-eaten by time, but legible when she cleaned them with an alcohol wipe. BioShield, Chamber K. The word landed with the weight of the email subject line she'd tried to treat like a prank. Someone had grown a door on top of a door. Her headlamp caught a pattern in the braid, bands at regular intervals, like growth rings. When she traced them gently with a gloved finger, she felt the ridges step down from newer to older material. This vault had been tended, fed, reinforced. Nature doesn't keep schedules. People do. The colony had been coaxed to become a wall. She found the wheel by accident. Her scraper snagged a spoke hidden under a thickened fold. She pried carefully until the biofilm peeled back, revealing a ship's wheel embedded flush into the sealed surface. It didn't spin. It didn't budge. She worked around its circumference, cutting away layers, each darker and harder than the last. The braid had fused into carbon black glass along the seams, a heat-tempered shell born of stress. Her phone vibrated. For a second, she thought it was the room. The screen showed a campus safety alert. Condemned annex access detected. Her badge had pinged a network she hadn't known still existed. A dot pulsed on a tiny floor plan she hadn't subscribed to. She put the phone in airplane mode and slipped it deep into the field kit. "Don't break the seal," her mentor had said. But what if the seal was the only thing standing between a story and its burial? She hesitated, letting the memory of rejection emails pass like a slow wave. Every no she'd ever gotten had felt like air thinning. This felt like air returning. She listened again. The whispering behind the wall wasn't just air. There was a pulse to it, a faint, intermittent hum. Emergency power on a dying loop. Somewhere behind the braid, machinery was still keeping a promise it had been told to keep for decades. She cut a final ring around the wheel and set the scraper aside. Both hands on the spokes, weight forward, she leaned and pulled. Nothing. She shifted, planted her boots, and tried again. The wheel twitched. The braid cracked along a seam, a spiderweb line radiating out. She braced and pulled with her whole body. The bond let go with a sound like ice breaking in spring. Cold air exhaled through the crack, sharp with disinfectant and old spores. She coughed once into her mask and steadied her breath. The Geiger ticked up a notch, then settled. Behind the door, the hum deepened, as if the room registered her presence and woke enough to notice. Her headlamp slid across smooth steel. The hatch face was riveted, industrial. Old enough to belong to a decade that believed heavy metal proved safety. A small, recessed panel sat to the right, its cover sealed under a lacquer of black. She scraped it free and found a keyway and a badge reader, the same model family her campus used 20 years ago. Her access card wouldn't know this language, but the reader blinked once, a tired ember. She tried the wheel again. It turned slow, each degree earned like a confession. Threads scraped, dust shook loose, and the braided mold shivered across the surface in a ripple that made her skin crawl. She paused until the movement subsided. Mold doesn't move on command. This did. The last quarter turn gave way, and the wheel locked in an open position. She set her palm against the hatch and pushed. It didn't swing. Negative pressure held it, the room's lung gripping a long-held breath. She worked the edge with her scraper, prying until the seal broke. The door eased, an inch, then two, the cold pouring out, the phenolic note rising like a memory. Her badge, buried in a pocket, vibrated again, even in airplane mode. This network hadn't forgotten how to find its own. She lifted the headlamp beam through the crack and saw darkness organized into lines, conduits, the rim of a console, the curve of a chair. Not a tomb, a chamber, built to be left alone. She stopped. Not out of fear, out of respect for what opening a vault means. Once you cross a threshold like this, you don't get to pretend you didn't. She checked her seals, tightened her hood, and whispered out loud without meaning to. Contain, occlude, guard. Then she slipped her hand through, found the interior latch, and eased the heavy door into a world that had been kept breathing by a wall grown from the very thing it was meant to keep at bay. The hinge settled, and the chamber inhaled, a slow draw that lifted dust from consoles in tiny storms. Cold gathered along the floor like water. The air carried phenolic disinfectant and the bitter edge of old spores, the kind that live quiet until light disturbs them. She stepped through, careful, letting the headlamp sweep over panels and pipes that still remembered their labels. Emergency power flickered awake in a stutter, a green diode here, a red bar there, a heartbeat struggling to prove it still could. Somewhere beneath the floor, a fan turned once and failed, then caught again, wheezing into rhythm. A workstation hummed under a plastic sheeting yellowed by time, its edges taped and retaped, as if someone had sealed their last task with a ritual. On a central table, a logbook sat inside a brittle sleeve. She peeled it back and felt the plastic cling to her gloves like a plea. Pages crackled. Handwriting slanted and precise ran down lines in a practiced hand. Containment by bioocclusion achieved. The next entry, Phase 3, pending clearance. Then a sharp change. The word lockdown scrawled across 2 lines, pressure visible in the ink. The date column stopped there. No signatures. No debrief. An intercom clicked from the wall, a soft, tired contact. She froze. A hiss filled the room, and then a voice emptied through the speaker, thin and recorded. If you're hearing this, we didn't get permission. The tone was steady, stripped of performance. This method buys time. It doesn't forgive decisions. The line cut, then repeated, like a loop set to play until current died or someone listened. She let it play once more, then found the toggle and silenced the echo. Along the far rack, cryocassettes nested in foam. Their labels smudged but legible when she breathed lightly on the plastic. MYC B1 through MYC B9, a series, each followed by a hand-inked strain code and a temperature set point. Frost had etched constellations across a viewing window. The unit purred faintly, not cold enough to preserve life, but cold enough to insist it was trying. She didn't open it, not yet. A cardboard sleeve gave up a reel of magnetic tape when she lifted it by its edge. Someone had written on the leader in pencil, Testimony, lead, K. The letter looked like it had been carved rather than drawn, pressed hard enough to bite the paper beneath. She held it a second longer than she should have, then slid it into her pack, nested in a sterile bag. The Geiger in her pocket ticked, an old analog sound that felt out of place in a room designed to control subtler dangers. She traced it to a waist-high canister in a corner cabinet. Its hazard triangle faded to ghost colors. The clicks climbed, not alarming, but honest. She stepped back. The stakes were real enough without inviting a second kind of history into her lungs. She moved through micro-stories left on every surface. A coffee mug with a hairline crack set on a coaster that read, Property of Facilities. A pin taped to its cap so the cap wouldn't vanish. A note in the margin of a schematic. Bridge thicker near seam. Human hands had lived here, not as villains, not as saints, just as people working a problem until the problem worked them back. She found a small locker near the door, the kind you'd keep a personal kit in. Inside, a sealed bag with 2 badges, both expired decades ago. One had a first name rubbed to a blur. The other read simply K. She held it up to the headlamp and wondered if the recorded voice belonged to the same letter now fading behind plastic. The workstation under the sheeting waited like a question. She lifted the cover and found a keyboard with the old sculpted keys, the kind you had to press like you meant it. A toggle switch on the side of a squat tower sat in the off position. She hovered, then pushed it. The fan spun, coughed, then settled into a steady whine. The screen warmed from black to a phosphor glow, text crawling into a login line. Chamber K, BioShield Ops. No network, no date, just a prompt. She didn't try to break it. Not here, not now. She took photos. The logbook pages, the cassettes, the tape label, the loop message plate by the intercom with its stamped instruction. Repeat until cleared. She recorded the hum of the room, the way the fan dipped every 20 seconds, the cadence of a machine that had kept watch beyond obligation. The Geiger's clicks softened as she moved back toward the hatch. She did one last sweep and saw a smear on the floor near the inner latch. Not blood, not oil, something like the pigment shift she'd seen in the dish. It feathered out toward the seam where braid met steel, as if the mold had tested the bound edge and retreated. This was the line it respected, or the line it had been taught to patrol. She backed out slowly, easing the door until the gasket kissed the frame but didn't seal. She wouldn't entomb evidence. Not yet. She slid the wheel just enough to hold. Then she stood in the hush and listened to the chamber breathe, the faint rise and fall that matched her own until the rhythms blurred. On the threshold, she understood the room's design in one clean thought. BioShield was never just a colony. It was a pact, a living seal to buy time for people to decide who they were. She stepped into the annex light, the cold peeling from her suit like smoke. In her pack, a logbook rustled. The tape settled against the side pocket with a small thud. The Geiger calmed to the background tick of an old building. She pulled the hatch to its resting place and laid a sheet of sterilized plastic over the biofilm she'd cut, a marker to show where she'd been and where the next hands would start. She didn't get answers. She got a story that refused to stay buried. And that, she knew, was more dangerous than any siren. Back at the lab, the world pretended to be ordinary. Fluorescents hummed. A centrifuge ticked. Then, the knock. Polite. 3 taps. 2 officials stepped in with practiced warmth. Environmental biohazard compliance, the taller one said, flashing a crisp badge just long enough for the shape, not the details. We've had reports of potentially contaminated materials removed from a restricted site. Mind if we ensure public safety? They smiled the way people do when they expect you to nod. She didn't. Who filed the report? She asked. Anonymous, he said, not missing a beat. The shorter one scanned the benches with a casual glance that cataloged everything. Voluntary transfer is always easier, he added. We'll handle chain of custody, minimal disruption. The thing about rehearsed kindness is that it leaves no fingerprints. But their shoes told a different story. Dry soles on a rain-slick floor. The kind of polish you don't ruin walking across campus. She glanced at the door log on her monitor. No entries recorded for their names. No visitor IDs. Their badges didn't exist to the building. They existed only to her. I'll need to consult protocols, she said, buying seconds. Of course, the taller one replied, already easing closer to her pack. In the meantime, why don't we just secure the items? He was offering help while reaching for control. She stepped between him and the bag, calm, even. Nothing leaves without documentation. His smile thinned, but he didn't drop it. We can do that at our facility. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it. Instead, she lifted a clipboard and started a series of questions that sounded obedient and were meant to stall. Agency number, supervisor, incident ID. The shorter one gave alphanumeric strings that felt true in the mouth, but slid off the page like oil. While they answered, she tapped a silent macro on her keyboard with her free hand. A scanner on the far bench woke and began capturing the log pages she'd laid out like a routine. Her laptop camera rolled. A cloud backup spun up over cellular, routed through a personal account she never used at work. They moved through the space like men used to, getting their way without raising their voices. We appreciate your cooperation, the taller one said. We'll be quick. She nodded like she agreed. Inside, the clock in her head got louder. She slid the magnetic tape into a tray, set the lid on like she was labeling samples, and photographed the case. The scanner chimed once. Then the building did something stranger. A fire alarm wailed from the neighboring corridor. Sprinklers engaged with a hiss and dance of water, everywhere except her hallway. The overhead lines here stayed dry. The shorter official looked up with a mild annoyance that didn't fit a real emergency. We should evacuate, she said, knowing they wouldn't. The taller one smiled again. We'll help you carry what matters. Smoke sneaked under the door from 2 labs down, acrid and wrong. Not electrical, accelerant. She coughed, fingers quick on the keyboard, launching a second upload off her phone. The scanner blinked error as droplets hit its housing through the ventilation, somehow only in this room. A localized failure, precise as a scalpel. Copies on the bench blackened at the edges as smoke drifted. She made a choice in one clean motion. Popped the tape reel into an inner pocket, slipped the cryo-labels photo into her sleeve, and slide the original logbook into a biohazard bag under a stack of innocuous cultures. Now, the shorter one said, voice firmer, for safety. His hand hovered over her pack. She lifted her hands, palms open, and let him see nothing he could legally take. The uploads ticked forward on her phone, a tiny progress bar crawling while the room staged a distraction. "There's an off-site protocol," she said. "I've initiated it." He paused. "Define off-site." "Redundant archive," she answered. "Truth shaped like misdirection." He didn't press. The fire door at the end of the hall slammed. Footsteps. Real building staff, confused voices filtering through the siren. The taller official recalibrated in an instant. "We'll be in touch," he said lightly, the smile back in place. "Public safety is everyone's responsibility." He placed a card on her bench, name, number, no emblem, and they left with unhurried steps, like men who believed time worked for them. She shut the door and slid to the floor, coughing once, listening for the fan under her desk. Still running. The phone's bar hit 92%, 94. Her eyes stung. Copies in the printer tray had curled and crisped into illegible ghosts. The smoke had targeted paper and circuits, but her cellular link kept breathing. 98. A final bloom of heat rolled under the door, then dulled as the building suppression caught up. One last ping. Upload complete. She exhaled. They could burn a room. They couldn't burn what was already everywhere. She moved fast, wiped surfaces, sealed the original log in a secondary bag, slipped the tape into a hardened case, and tucked both inside a box labeled with the most boring word in her space: Agar. She reset her computer, cleared the macro history, and pulled the fire alarm in her own corridor so no one could say she had ignored procedure. By the time campus responders arrived, she was outside in the rain, hood up, face a mask of professional worry. She answered questions with precision. Smoke, yes. Fire, unclear. Visitors, environmental biohazard compliance. She'd gladly provide the card. She handed it to the officer without letting her hands shake. He studied it, frowned, then tucked it away like a problem for later. Her phone buzzed again, not an alert. An email reply. Received. Mirrored. Safe. From a server she'd set up years ago as a private joke, a dead man's inbox. She didn't smile. She just looked at the building and understood the shape of the threat. They'd started with smiles. Next, they'd send paperwork sharpened into a weapon. She pulled her hood tighter and walked back to the lab's threshold, with the same sentence steady in her chest. They could burn a room. They couldn't burn the truth that had already learned how to spread. She laid everything out on the kitchen table like a crime scene she refused to misread. Photos of the hatch, the stenciled letters, the logbook pages flattened under glass, still damp at the edges. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant from the chamber, as if the air had followed her home and wouldn't let go. She pressed record on a voice memo, not for drama, but for discipline. Project name, BioShield. Function, bioocclusion, living seals. Objective, she paused. Objective, time. The logbook filled in the shape. Containment by bioocclusion achieved, they'd written. The next pages weren't triumph. They were triage. Notes on feed cycles for the colony. Stress prompts to thicken at seams. Pigment shift indexed against disinfectants. A schematic. Hatch perimeter. Reinforced braid layers 7 through 11. The mold hadn't just grown. It had been trained like a dam that repairs itself when water claws at its cracks. Then the line no one had said out loud. Phase 3, pending clearance. In the margins, a shorthand she recognized from lab days when people wrote truth smaller than policy. Personnel relocation incomplete. A second hand had crossed it out, thick and dark. Below, one sentence survived the edits. Do not open. Fatal risk of breach. She traced the groove of the pen as if pressure could give her names. She cued the tape. The voice that filled the room wasn't theatrical. It was bone-tired and specific. We were told it was remediation. It became erasure. The word erasure hung there, heavier than any hazard symbol. Initial incident contained by bioocclusion, the voice continued. Secondary directive expanded to records. He listed categories: reagent logs, trial footage, personnel lists. Occlude the room, Occlude the paper. Occlude the memory. He didn't name himself, only Lead K. The testimony wasn't an apology. It was a ledger. She flipped to the back pages of the logbook and found a ledger of her own, a visitor log from before the lockdown. Names, dates, initials beside oversight. She didn't recognize them until the fourth entry, a last name that carried weight in every symposium she'd ever sat through. She took a photo and sent it to her mentor with a single line. "Do you know these?" The typing dots appeared, disappeared, then returned. 2, he wrote. Advisory boards, both still active. She stood very still. The colony had sealed a door. The ledger had sealed a reputation. If she published without context, it would look like conspiracy dressing itself as history. If she waited, the room she'd opened would close behind her, this time with her inside. The call came before she decided. Late, a quiet ring that felt like someone tugging a thread. Her mentor's voice was smaller than she'd ever heard it. "I was there when they closed the wing," he said. "I didn't know who stayed behind." Silence, then a breath. "We were told it was safer not to ask. We believed it. That's what I can't fix." She didn't comfort him. She said what the tape had already taught her to say aloud. "We're not talking about a mess. We're talking about a decision." He exhaled. "Then make a different one." He began reading names from memory, cross-matching them to titles that still opened doors. When he reached the second name from her photo, he faltered. "That signature. I wrote a recommendation for that person last year." The thing about guilt is that it doesn't rewrite the past. It makes the next sentence matter more. "We need daylight," she said. "All of it." She started assembling the press packet with the same focus she used to plate sales. Clean lines, verified captions, no flourish. Photos of the hatch, the stenciling, the will with braid peeled back in measured arcs, scans of the log entries with dates unobscured, including the shift from Phase 3 pending to lockdown. Still frames of the cryo-cassette labels, MYC B1 through MYC B9, with set points. A short audio excerpt of Lead K saying the sentence no one could misinterpret. We were told it was remediation. It became erasure. Her notes included a disclaimer. No assumption of criminal intent, only documentation of actions taken and their effects. She wrote a cover letter that didn't accuse. It asked, who authorized the use of living bioocclusion to entomb not only hazardous materials, but information? What safeguards existed, and who reviewed them? Which personnel were accounted for at closure, and which were not? She added one more line, the one that would either blow the story open or get her tenure file shredded. 2 names on the oversight log currently sit on advisory boards regulating biosafety funding. The clock on her laptop slid toward noon. She scheduled a synchronized release, national outlets, a regional paper that still fought above its weight, and a journal whose editor she trusted to demand receipts before printing a headline. She didn't ask permission. She asked for accountability. Then the pass reached forward and squeezed. A text from an unknown number. Don't. A minute later, an email from the dean's office. Emergency meeting regarding lab access. 10 after, a formal notice. Injunction pending. Funding under review. Access suspended under biohazard evaluation. They weren't subtle anymore. They hoped interruption would buy erasure a little more time. She glanced at the hardened case on her table. The tape, the log, the photos. She wasn't going to lose them to a lock or a smile. She walked to a back room, moved the tray of routine cultures, and slid the originals into a secondary vault she'd grown herself. A dense decoy colony layered over a sealed compartment, indistinguishable from 12 other plates, except to her. She'd learned from BioShield. If they trusted mold to hide their secret, she'd trust it to protect the truth. She hit send. The packet left her laptop like a held breath, finally exhaled. The thing about roots is that they don't announce their work. They find the crack and widen it quietly, until daylight does the rest. The injunction arrived like a weather front, paper-heavy, language colder than the annex air. Her lab was sealed pending biohazard review. Her badge stopped working at the turnstile. A finance email followed, clinical and final. Funding frozen until compliance cleared. She stood in the lobby with a box of nothing and understood the plan. If smiles failed, paperwork would starve the work. She called her mentor. No answer. She texted. We sent the packet. The dots didn't appear. 20 minutes later, she tried his office. The door swung open on quiet hinges. A cup of tea sat cooling on a saucer. Steam gone, surface skinned. A chair sat crooked, not toppled. Papers lay aligned. One page slid an inch to the left by a hand that hadn't put it back. She said his name into the room. Nothing answered. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unlisted number. A location pin near the river's old waterworks substation. 4 words. Bring originals. Come alone. Then a second pulse. A photo. Blurred. Unmistakable. Her mentor. Seated. Eyes open. Not panic. Instruction. She didn't bargain with silence. She called a journalist whose edits still cut clean. You'll record, she said. You won't intervene unless a life is at risk. He didn't hesitate. I'm already driving. She opened an app she'd built and never used, a dead man switch. If her phone went dark for more than 15 minutes, an archive would publish with coordinates, names, audio. She toggled it on and felt something steady inside settle into place. To reach the originals, she had to pass the sealed lab. 2 guards stood where none had stood yesterday. She didn't look at them. She walked to a secondary storage closet down the service hall, the one with the lab-grown decoy colony that had taken weeks to train into a convincing shape. She pulled the tray, slid a blade through a seam only she knew, and hinged back a living lid. Inside, a watertight sleeve with 2 things that mattered, the logbook and the tape. Mold had hidden a lab for 40 years. It could hide a truth for 40 minutes. She packed light, sterile gloves, the hardened case, a spare phone with a clean SIM, a flashlight, a small recorder, and the kind of calm she didn't recognize until she heard herself breathe. On the way out, she left a note with campus security, written like policy, designed like armor. Responding to an external compliance request, all movements logged. She wasn't asking permission. She was building a paper trail they couldn't bend. The road to the substation ran along water that forgot it had once mattered. Concrete shoulders flaked like old paint. Buildings leaned into their own shadows. She parked 2 blocks out and walked, the case tucked under a jacket that made her look like anyone leaving a shift too late. Inside, sound changed. Concrete swallowed it, returned only the footsteps you brought with you. The air was damp and metallic. She checked her phone. The live stream link awaited a tap. She didn't press it yet, not until she saw a silhouette that told her he was still breathing. At the threshold, she paused and pictured her lab. The centrifuge idle, the incubator dark, the colony in its dish, still working the problem it had been trained to solve. The thing about pressure is that it doesn't create character. It compresses it until the shape shows. Her mentor's voice wasn't here to caution her. It lived in the steady, old cadence of his notes. Bridge thicker near seam. She moved with that line in her ear. Reinforce where stress will try to split you. She texted the journalist her exact position and sent a single word. Now. He replied with a photo from the street outside. A police cruiser already redirecting traffic 2 blocks down. Independent biosafety officers on a group thread pinged back a checklist, then confirmation. Arrival in 5. She slid on gloves and touched the case, not as a trophy, but as a measure. The people who taught mold to seal secrets had trusted biology to keep quiet. She trusted exposure to keep people honest. Her phone's timer rolled past 14 minutes, then reset when she tapped the screen with a knuckle. The dead man's switch breathed again. She stepped into the substation's cold and raised her voice just enough to carry without trembling. I brought what you asked for, and you brought witnesses. The sentence landed. Footsteps moved in the dark. The next moment would test more than courage. It would test whether truth could spread faster than fear. Concrete swallowed the last of her footsteps. Damp air held the metallic taste of old pipes and decisions that never fully drained. She set the hardened case on a cracked control console and let her voice travel. You wanted originals? I brought proof. But I didn't come alone. A figure peeled from the shadow. First the posture, then the face she knew. Her mentor sat on a chair, wrist bound with plastic ties, eyes clear. He shook his head once, not in fear, warning. Two others stepped forward. No clipboards, no pretense. The taller one's smile was gone. Compliance ended when you involved the press, he said. This could have been quiet. And stay buried another 40 years? She asked. That's not quiet. That's rot. They fanned to either side, confident in a room designed to echo orders. Put the case on the floor, the shorter one said, voice flat now. Slide it forward. She didn't move. Instead, she angled her phone on the console and tapped the link. A soft chime confirmed the stream. A red dot winked to life. Across town, a journalist's voice threaded into the feed, measured and present. We are live. The taller one glanced at the phone and almost laughed. Headlines fade. He gestured at her mentor like he was a misplaced file. This ends now. Hand it over. She popped the case latches, not to surrender, but to choose the order of what breathed. First, the reel, its label visible to the lens. Testimony, lead K. Then the logbook, open to Phase 3 pending clearance, followed by the hard scrawl, lockdown. She held the mic close and hit play. The hiss rose. Then the voice entered the room, thin but steady. We were told it was remediation. It became erasure. The word erasure traveled farther than any badge. The men stilled, not from guilt, but from calculation slipping. Turn it off, the shorter one said. Turn it off now. She didn't. She stepped aside so the audience could see them both, the reel turning like a second hand. Her mentor lifted his chin and spoke into the sound. You closed the wing, he said, voice rough. You left people in the ledger and called it containment. The taller one reached inside his jacket. She took a breath she'd trained for in biosafety hoods. Slow, precise, controlled. You don't want that on a live stream. Her phone chimed again. The journalist's tone sharpened. Independent biosafety officers en route. Police alerted to coordinates. Unknown to the men, tires crunched on gravel outside. 2 sets, then 3. The shorter one's eyes flicked to the doorway. He recalibrated. We walk out together, he said. You carry nothing. You walked in without names, she answered. You'll leave with him. Boots hit the entry. Real officers' voices broke the damp. Hands visible! The taller one didn't argue. He knew how far theatrics traveled when watched. The shorter one stared at the phone, then at her, then set his hands wide, fingers spread. Plastic zip ties appeared, a neutral practice ritual. As they were led out, the taller one offered a last rehearsal. You don't understand the scale. Government absorbs. People forget. She didn't rise to his script. She turned the real volume up. Tell them again, she said to the voice. All of it. Her mentor's apology fell into the damp like a small bell that carried anyway. I should have pulled the alarm 40 years ago. She cut the ties with a lab blade she tucked into her sleeve, the motion neat from years of paring parafilm. He stood slow, steadier than she expected. You pulled it today, she said, and you did it where they could hear. Outside, the night felt larger, like air had re-entered a building sealed too long. The officers logged the case, photographed the labels, read the lines she'd already read until the dates reached their faces. The journalist held the feed steady, never stepping into the scene, only catching the moment the past changed tense. In the doorway, she looked back once at the old controls, the dead dials, the damp concrete that had listened without choice. She thought of the chamber, still breathing under the annex, of the braid that had learned to thicken where stress would try to split it. The mold hadn't only sealed a door, it had held a story under pressure until it could be heard. Morning came with statements instead of apologies. The university released careful language first, recognizing historical infrastructure beneath the condemned annex and committing to a full independent assessment. The federal notice followed, thinner and denser at the same time, acknowledging that records may reflect legacy containment practice and appointing an external review panel. No one said BioShield out loud. They didn't have to. The word had already spread. Her injunction lifted with a single line buried in a paragraph. Access restored, pending oversight. She held the letter like a glass slide, tilting it to see if truth refracted anywhere in the print. It didn't. Paper doesn't change its nature. People do. She clipped the page to a folder and went back to work. Sleep broke into fragments, 30 minutes here, an hour there. In the space between, she replayed the wheel turning, the room inhaling, the recorded voice choosing one word with a precision that cut. Erasure. She let the fragments sit where they fell. Rest would wait. Preservation couldn't. She walked to the condemned wing with the binder in her hands and witness forms under her arm. A junior biosafety officer met her at the door, handwriting neat, eyes unwilling to pretend this was ordinary. Together they entered the annex. The braid looked the same. That was the point. Evidence that changes while you watch it stops being evidence. She marked the cut line with flags and ink, logged temperatures, humidity, the slow pulse of the emergency lights that still tried to matter. At the hatch, she didn't spin the wheel. She laid a sterile sheet along the seam and taped it in place, a clear sign to anyone who followed that this door remained in situ, under audit. The officer initialed the tape. She did too. The room beyond had kept breathing without help for decades. It could wait a little longer while oversight remembered how to be oversight. On her way out, she paused at the console where her phone had first vibrated in her pocket. Some old network waking to her badge like a muscle memory. She logged the ping time and filed it. Small details would sharpen later. Right now, the job was to keep everything where it could be seen. Back in her office, the inbox ticked with reactions that didn't know each other but sounded like they'd rehearsed. Shock, gratitude, worry, warning. One message came from an address that wasn't a person, an institutional account that served as a gate between departments. It offered nothing more than a sentence. We're glad you're safe. No signature. She archived it with the same care she gave the logbook. Unaltered, time-stamped, traceable. Her mentor sat across from her, bruise yellowing along the cheekbone, hands wrapped around a mug he couldn't bring himself to drink. They'll try to rewrite it, he said. They'll soften the decisions into weather. She didn't argue. That's why the room stays sealed until the panel walks through it, she answered. And why the copies already live where signatures can't reach. He nodded, eyes on the binder. You going back? She didn't pretend to hesitate. Yes. He closed his eyes for a moment that held 40 years. Then I'm going with you. She shook her head. You'll sit on the panel and ask the questions you didn't ask last time. He took the correction like a vow. On the third day, the mail arrived with nothing unusual on the outside. Brown envelope. No return address. The weight told a different story. Inside, a small steel key lay against plain card, heavy for its size. A tag hung from a loop of string, 2 letters and a number stamped into old laminate, Annex C. Beneath it, a note, hand-printed, unadorned. You opened the wrong door first. She held the key without moving, the metal warming against her skin. There are moments when curiosity is a kindness and moments when it's a weapon. This felt like both. The handwriting didn't try to disguise itself. It didn't grandstand. It assumed she would understand the map before she unfolded it. She placed the card beside the binder and didn't touch either for a full minute, forcing stillness to stand between impulse and action. She went back to the annex that afternoon, key in her pocket, not as a hero, but as a witness who knew when to mark the ground. She traced the corridor past Chamber K, past a junction she hadn't noticed in the first rush. A fire door sat warped in its frame, painted over too many times to open without effort. Behind it, silence like a room holding breath. She didn't try the key. Not yet. She took a photo of the tag plate, logged the coordinates, and turned around. Outside, the sky held the color of stainless steel before rain. She stood under it and let the thought settle. She could choose peace for a week, a month. She could hand the key to the panel and wait while committees remembered how to move. She could also do what the project had asked of her since the first clink under living skin. Decide. She pocketed the key. That night, she placed the small mark on the map pinned above her desk, a pencil dot where Annex C turned the corridor into a question. She didn't draw a line to it. She didn't need to. The line already existed between a door she'd opened and another someone else had closed. Meanwhile, somewhere in the building, a second latch waited. Waiting has its own gravity. She set her alarm for an hour earlier than she would need. She listed tasks in a clean hand: preserve, document, notify, rest. She kept the last word on the page even if it felt aspirational. The colony in her incubator had begun to form a ring along the edge of the steel bead she'd placed days ago, thickening where stress would most likely split the surface. It was doing exactly what it had been trained to do. She turned off the light and let the room go dark on purpose. The thing about hidden paths is that they don't disappear when you stop looking. They wait. And so did she, with a key in her pocket and a second hatch in her mind, knowing that the story hadn't ended. It had changed tense. What they buried wasn't just data. It was the guilt of leaving doors locked from the inside and calling it safety. What we learn is simple. Resilience is a hidden path. Truth finds daylight the way roots find a crack in concrete. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts on accountability below. Subscribe to uncover more stories of courage and consequence. And watch the next chapter as we follow the key to Annex C and the cover-ups it was built to hide.